Rome survived a brutal persecution, but Pope Saint Marcellus I was exiled to his death for one shocking reason. He refused to let terrified Christians return to communion without real public repentance. Pope Saint Marcellus I is remembered on January 16th as a rebuilding pope in the ruins of persecution. His story begins in Rome, when the church was bruised, divided, and struggling to breathe again. For years, the Diocletianic persecution had shattered communities, seized meeting places, and terrified clergy. After Pope Marcellinus died in 304, the Roman See stood vacant for a long interval in chaos and fear. Only when Maxentius took control of Rome did the pressure ease enough for election to become possible. Around May or June of 308, Marcellus was chosen as Bishop of Rome, stepping into a city full of wounds. The surviving sources tell us almost nothing reliable about his childhood or family, which is itself revealing. He emerges from the shadows only when the burden of leadership falls on him at the worst moment. Tradition holds that he had served as a priest of the Roman Church before becoming pope, likely under Marcellinus. He therefore knew the hidden network of Christians, catacombs, and households that had kept faith alive. The Rome he inherited was not only traumatized by violence, but fractured by arguments over forgiveness. Many believers had lapsed under threat, and some now demanded immediate restoration as if nothing had happened. Other Christians, especially confessors and the steadfast, feared cheap reconciliation would erase the cost of fidelity. Marcellus tried to hold both justice and mercy together by insisting on public penance for the lapsed. He did not create penance from nothing, but he reasserted it as a visible medicine for a public wound. In doing so, he made enemies among those who wanted communion without conversion and peace without truth. His first task was practical as well as spiritual, because the church's structure in Rome had been disrupted. According to early Roman tradition recorded later, he reorganized the local administration into districts. These districts are often described as 25 tituli, each served by a priest responsible for pastoral care. The priests were to prepare catechumens for baptism, oversee discipline, and manage burials and commemorations. This matters because persecution had not only killed people, but also broken the ordinary rhythms of worship. Rebuilding meant restoring places, restoring order, and restoring the confidence that Christian life could be public again. Marcellus also promoted the care of the dead because the catacombs were both sacred memory and social lifeline. A key site linked with him is the Catacomb of Priscilla on the Via Salaria, a major Roman cemetery. Tradition also connects him with a new burial place called the Coemitarium Novellae on the Via Salaria. Even these details show the same theme, because a persecuted church thinks about graves as much as altars. But the central drama of his pontificate was not architecture, it was the battle over repentance and communion. The lapsed, called lapsi, were not a small fringe, because fear had pushed many into denial. Some came back sincerely, ready for discipline, while others returned with anger and political pressure. Marcellus required a penitential process, and his firmness is credited with sparking public disturbances. Street disorder in Rome was something Maxentius could not tolerate, especially while securing his own rule. So the state intervened, not in theology, but in public order, and the Pope became the convenient target. Sources describe Marcellus being seized and sent into exile late in 308 or early in 309. He was not executed in a formal trial, but he was removed, humiliated, and placed under harsh conditions. Some traditions say he was forced into servile labor, even assigned to care for animals or stables. The Roman martyrology describes beatings with clubs and labor under guard, ending in death through suffering. Other accounts are more cautious, saying only that he died soon after exile because of privations. This difference is important because early martyrologies often preserve memory in the language of witness, not paperwork. What remains consistent is that his downfall was tied to his defense of ecclesial discipline after persecution. The ancient poet and Pope Damasus later composed an epitaph honoring Marcellus for guarding peace and truth. In that inscription, the crisis is framed as sedition and discord stirred up by opponents of penance. Damasus even suggests Marcellus died on a Sicilian shore, a detail that hints at where exile ended. Whether Sicily is literal geography or poetic memory, the point is that exile carried him to death. By January 16th of 309, his pontificate was over, and the Roman Church would soon elect Pope Eusebius. Marcellus is therefore remembered as a pope who ruled for a short time but faced an enormous task. If you want a single sentence for his legacy, it is this: he rebuilt the church by rebuilding repentance. That line may sound abstract, but in Rome it meant denying mobs their demands and refusing shortcuts. It also meant protecting the Eucharist from becoming a political badge instead of a sacrament of reconciliation. His policy was not about cruelty, but about taking sins seriously enough to take mercy seriously too. Public penance was meant to heal scandal, restore trust, and make conversion visible in a wounded community. In the aftermath of persecution, that visibility mattered, because Christians had watched neighbors betray and neighbors die. Marcellus tried to reknit a community whose bonds had been ripped by fear and coerced betrayal. That is why later writers call him a confessor and also a martyr, even without a sword. In the early church, martyrdom could include death from exile and brutal treatment endured for Christ's cause. This is how the Roman tradition came to honor him as a martyr for the confession of the faith. After his death, he was buried on the Via Salaria, and his tomb was remembered by Roman guides. His veneration appears in the Depositio Episcoporum within the chronography of 354, which marks January 16th for him. That early listing shows his cult was established in Rome long before medieval legend grew around his name. Over time, devotion attached strongly to the church of San Marcello al Corso in Rome, dedicated in his honor. His relics are traditionally said to rest beneath the altar there, tying the saint to a living parish. The artwork and iconography that depict him often emphasize papal authority, and the stable labor legend. You may see him with papal symbols and sometimes with signs of humiliation and endurance. It is worth being honest about what we do not know, because hagiography can fill gaps with imagination. We do not have firm evidence for a list of personal friendships, family relations, or a detailed early education. We do not have a diary of his thoughts or letters that narrate his policy in his own words. Yet, the outline of his actions is clear enough to learn from because the crisis was public and recorded. He took office after a vacancy, he restructured pastoral districts, he enforced penance, and he was exiled. In that short sequence, you can see a blueprint for post-crisis leadership in the early Catholic world. He did not govern in a golden age, but in the hangover of terror and the temptation to compromise. He faced two opposite dangers, one of despair that freezes the church, and one of cheap peace that hollows it. His answer was a disciplined mercy, slow enough to be real and firm enough to withstand pressure. Because his canonization predates modern procedures, there is no later beatified by or canonized by decree to cite. Instead, His sainthood rests on ancient and continuous veneration in the Roman Church, witnessed in early calendars. That is how many early popes and martyrs are recognized by the Church's memory before formal tribunals existed. If you are looking for miracles, the historical record focuses more on governance than on wonder stories. Later traditions sometimes attribute miracles and conversions to his intercession, but they are not the core evidence. The core evidence is the witness of a shepherd who accepted exile rather than surrender the Church's discipline. When Rome was politically unstable, he refused to let the sacraments be dictated by mobs or emperors. When Christians were ashamed of their past, he gave them a path back that required truth-telling and change. When the faithful were tempted to vengeance, he offered reconciliation structured by penance, not by vendetta. His conflict with the lapsi also foreshadows later debates about rigorism and laxity in Christian moral life. You can read his story as an early chapter in the Church's long effort to balance holiness and mission. Too much laxity would have made persecution victories meaningless, but too much hardness would have closed the door to sinners. Marcellus tried to stand on the narrow ridge where both mercy and justice can remain intact. It is telling that Damasus praises him for preserving peace because discipline was meant to end conflict, not inflame it. Yet, discipline can provoke conflict before it heals, and Marcellus paid for that with exile and death. His feast on January 16th, therefore, remembers not a miracle worker in the marketplace, but a pope in the furnace. It invites you to picture Rome not as marble postcards, but as alleys, cemeteries, and households whispering prayers. It invites you to picture Christians returning from fear, standing in line to confess, and learning courage again. It invites you to picture a bishop insisting that repentance is not humiliation, but the doorway to communion. And it invites you to picture the state, nervous about riots, choosing to silence the pastor rather than the mob. Marcellus did not outlive the crisis, but his approach shaped what came after, including later papal responses to the lapsed. His successor, Eusebius, would face similar unrest, showing that the wound in Rome was deeper than one pontificate. So when you remember Marcellus, remember a church learning how to be public again after being hunted. Remember a pope building administration because administration protects the weak and makes mercy concrete. Remember a pope who believed that the church can forgive everything, but must never pretend nothing happened. If you want a final image, think of him leaving Rome under guard, stripped of dignity but not of faith. He disappears into exile, and the historical record goes quiet because martyrdom often ends in silence. Then his name returns on calendars, on tombs, and in liturgy, because the Church refuses to forget her witnesses. On January 16th, the Roman Church says his name again, and the lesson remains painfully modern. A community cannot rebuild without truth, and truth without mercy becomes cruelty, so he held both together.